Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome. You guys, it's like Artist Talk IRL and on Zoom, 2022, first time in a long time. So it's great to see all of you. Yeah, so I'd like to welcome you all. This is our first dual format Zoom and in-person lecture. And so we're really excited, and just everybody fingers crossed that it stays that way. I want to first, before we get going, I'd like to sort of welcome you to the MCC Art Department. If you are not currently following us on Instagram, there's an unofficial account, MCC_ARTDEPT. You can follow for all sorts of information, hijinks, and my misspellings of things. I'd like to quickly thank the IT department, Paul, Matt, Vernon, et al., sort of for helping us sort of get this arranged. We're really excited, and want to sort of thank Daniela Broderick, the Dean of Arts and Humanities, for her continued support of the arts programming. So that, and then not least of all, Trevor Power, who this is, I think, at least in my experience, the first time we've had a exhibiting artist in Gallery 1 and 2 talk about their work while their show is up. So that seems really fresh and exciting, and we couldn't be more pleased with the way Trevor is taking care of the curatorial parts of the art department. Really excited about this. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our visiting artist today, Hope Wang. Hope Wang is a Chicago-based artist, arts facilitator, and poet. She hosts and operates Loom Room, a floor loom rental studio for Chicago fiber artists. Wang is also a co-organizer of Chicago Textiles Week 2019 and 2021, Chicago's first textile exposition featuring a week-long program of events highlighting work spanning interiors, architecture, fine arts, and fashion. She received her BFA in 2018 from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and is a 2021 recipient of the Generator Arts Accelerator Program Grant. She has attended the Digital Weaving Lab Residency at Praxis Fiber Workshop, the Weaving Mill WARP Residency, and the Spudnik Press Cooperative Fellowship. So without further ado, let me welcome Hope Wang.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Trevor. And thank you all for inviting me to share with you my practice today. I'm really honored you're here. And there's so many of you. This is like also the first time I've given a talk in person in a long time. So I'm really happy to be here. And thank you again for coming here to listen to me talk about the silly garbage that I find in my everyday life. I'll start with a little introduction about me and where I've been from up until now. So I graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago with an emphasis in fiber and material studies in 2018. Since then, I've been rebuilding a studio practice outside of the institution and its resources since 2019. I took a year off when I graduated just to recover from the trauma of art school. And from there, I somehow conned the folks at Spudnik Press Cooperative that I could be a printmaking fellow, even though I barely printed at the time. But it felt like the most accessible way to explore art making, because weaving, which is largely what I had been doing in school, definitely wasn't readily available to me because the equipment is large and expensive. And as you'll see in just a second, the loom that I typically work on is very hard to come by outside of the school. So in May of 2021, I was able to access that loom again and work on a jacquard loom to create digital weavings for the first time since I'd graduated, which has kind of been a world of difference for my studio practice in the past year. So many of the pieces in my solo show on campus are from that residency, along with a couple works that had been made leading up to that time. So as you're peeking into this reel of my research material, my practice incorporates hand weaving, printmaking, bookmaking, and painting, and my work meditates on manual labor and often cites repetitive activity and walking as rituals for processing selfhood and placemaking. I reference imagery from eroded buildings and industrial spaces to explore how people produce and recall memories within the broader structures of our built environment. Advance forward, Justin.
Is that?
Okay, great. What did you click, Justin? So here is a video of me weaving on the jacquard loom. Just for a show of hands, who here is even vaguely familiar with weaving? Okay, great. That's a good number. And then jacquard weaving? Not really. So I am weaving here on the jacquard loom, and I'm glad to see that there's some people who are familiar with weaving. And so for those who aren't familiar with the jacquard loom, it's a computer-assisted loom whose software reads Photoshop files that I code with textile patterns. So this loom then controls when and where the individual threads lift to form a pattern or image. The rest of the weaving process is still analog like this, where I'm standing in front of it and I'm pressing a foot pedal and weaving. So that shuttle that you see in my hand, it's unspooling yarn across each line. So every single line in the composition of the cloth is still woven by the weaver and still an intentional move. It's not outsourced to this machine that sort of like outputs it. So this happens hundreds and thousands of times in order to form cloth. And in working through the digital weaving process, I'm able to push the limits of what material may appear to be and what it really is. So there's just a quick image of the TC2 jacquard loom at the Digital Weaving Residency I attended in May. I stayed in Cleveland at Praxis Fiber Workshop for a month-long independent weaving residency that I've spent the past summer and then fall, slowly finishing works and inventorying them. So Praxis is the only facility of its kind in the moment in the US for now, but there's really not another public resource for artists to independently rent time on this very inaccessible equipment. There are several universities around the country that teach generations of alumni on this and then don't invest or support any spaces outside of their institutions for those people who have made really compelling work in their programs to continue their research. So again, like I said, this was the first time I'd been able to weave on one in 3 years. So here I was for 27 days where I wove 23 of those days and made 30 pieces during that time. And the pieces that are actually in the show right now, they're like the sort of the last ones that I hadn't gotten to. And I'm really happy that they were able to have a space to get eyes on them the first time since they were made. And I'm really glad it was only a month for that residency because it was a lot, like physical labor. It was quantifiable and trackable. And I wove about 48,000 picks. So those are like 48,000 lines, 48,000 petals. And that's, again, like there's so much physical labor involved in this process. And that's really, as I'm going to talk about later in the talk, also part of the experience and the conceptual underpinnings of the work. So let's see. So in my attempt to further demystify this weaving process, here's a quick look at what the digital file coded with weave structures looks like when it gets translated into cloth. So what I did here is separate out the layers of the grayscale values in this image and then assigned each layer with a corresponding pattern. So you can imagine each white pixel might be the horizontal threads and the black pixels might be the vertical threads in the woven cloth. I'm still hand weaving this entire textile, but this particular loom reads the files and assists me in achieving these kinds of patterns by breaking them down and creating this sort of draft or code sequence. So in my practice, I'm drawn to the degrees of sloppy maintenance in public spaces. People work very hard, or sometimes not very diligently, to cover anything from peeling paint, architectural deterioration, graffiti. These signifiers, such as paint patches, construction plywood, yellow safety zoning, they all have a material quality that delineate how we function, occupy, and transit through spaces. And I didn't translate those signifiers into my work. People hardly make an attempt to keep the integrity of the original surface of a building. So instead, often painting over graffiti with a completely different color. In Chicago, it's often this brown in which the city mixes all the paints that they have to create this very boring, very distinct brown buff. And this symbol to me then negates its own attempt at coverage because it gives away what was once underneath in the first place. For me, I read it as both a ghosting and an explicit code of authority. And I've made a habit of photographing shuttered storefronts over the past few years, thinking about like these codes of authority and ghostings to then translate them into woven illusions. I draw from imagery surrounding storefronts that have a provisional quality, whether from business turnover, property displacement, or construction. These weavings depict reflections of pedestrians and shuttered spaces, suggested through motifs like blue tape, brown paper, plastic sheets, and spray painted plywood that bar the viewer's access to the realities that exist beyond the surface. So empty storefronts encountered in between life cycles of public-facing activity often register as negative space in the broader cultural context of the architectural landscape. It stands as a relic of failed architecture, regarded as without relevant narrative until the plastic, laminate wood, or brown paper comes down. And traversing the line between image and object, the woven window reflections employ the representational technique of trompe-l'oeil to question the viewer's initial understanding of what material and perception they come in with are. And so for me, these thin spaces between physical occupancy and material manipulation of textile and photography suggest that the meaning and memory are often in flux and often written over and over again. And in the same way that obsolete windows are filled with brick or covered spray paint marks with new paint never quite fit seamlessly to the original building, the wobble or the stutter of a pattern in a textile alludes to the alteration in structure. Seamlessness is an illusion with a tell for those who look long enough. And in a similar thought, I turned then to looking at the worn alterations and tire burn scars that disrupt the surface of roads and parking lots. Potholes, resurfaced blacktop, cracked painted crosswalks. This is a space that we view as purely functional. They are transient spaces that people pass through but do not see as a destination. And when people do not care about spaces and materials, they become extra sloppy and extra textural sites. And for me, all roads lead to the parking lot, And I so then began to view parking lots, roads, and sidewalks as sites of loss and longing, referring to the scars of recurring traffic left in the asphalt as wounds. I approach the structural environment as something more flesh-like, of body, of ghosts. I began to make these meticulous screen prints based on pictures of scarred asphalt that I found peculiar or funny. And the paper itself, if you've gotten to go upstairs to see it, is embossed with a texture to mimic that asphalt grain. And if you take a phone flashlight to the piece, you can kind of also see the texture and the sparkle of ink that I incorporated with this like iridescent ink in the gray to push the paper into appearing more so like the asphalt. And I also think of the constant uses of these surfaces, that through traffic, we wear away at crisp surfaces that often need repair or patching, and how the asphalt is a palimpsest reused and resurfaced with texture and text in order to signal its function again and again. And in thinking about palimpsests in language, I also felt compelled to bring my poetry practice into my visual work through that metaphor. I've always written alongside my visual practice, but these letterpress prints that I had done in the spring of 2021 are quite a bit of a departure from my previous work. Materializing my poetry into letterpress printed visual work was a very interesting process for me, and I specifically chose letterpress for the material quality of it. I think about poesis, the act of translating or materializing language or words into physical form, which would be text, visual text. That act of translating always creates some new information beyond just the language. And I think that was something that was really interesting for me as someone dealing with palimpsest and ghosting, is like in the moment, but when you move something from a concept to a physical form, you are creating these other tensions about color, about the font, the typeface, and then the placement of it on the page and how those all read and deliver new forms of information. So for me, the writing has always served as a place where I also cite walking and repetitive manual labor as rituals to process selfhood. So using the printing press as an elegiac material, I had the metal type meticulously set, printed, and then misprinted as if letters were shaken and lost over multiple runs through the press. And as someone who's worked several manual labor jobs, such as architectural historic preservation and printed textile manufacturing, I've been on construction sites and industrial sites entrenched in long hours and grueling repetitive work. So for me, this physical act, as well as the meticulousness of printing mistakes and to the point where they must be perfect was also something that I felt was really important as part of this process of using letterpress to create these new forms for my poems. And this is an image or images of some of the initial layers or the tests that it took to lay down the shifted typeface. So if you've gotten to see them, it's a letterpress print in which the poem has been printed several times, and several letters or various commas or punctuation they might have shifted below the line or just like one space over. And for me, it was really a compelling way to think about how to read this poem in a different way as we're viewing it. In some ways, it's unreadable because I like dropped a Y, or I might have dropped like an L or an I, or I might have pieced like half of a word somewhere else onto the composition. And for me, that was really exciting to think about, that the ways in which you might read something differently every time you access it, very similar to how we think about memory. And so then I settled there and then returned to what I like to now call sad ground art, thinking about, again, the ghosting and the reuse and the revisiting of materials and surfaces, the same way that I've done that with the window reflections, the letterpress prints, and the screen prints of asphalt. I wove these new weavings, taking reference from pictures I had taken in parking lots of these like large looping textures, as well as these screenshots that I had spent many, many hours just going through Google Images and finding fun satellite photos of these like activity, like the fun activity that might lead to scars that you can see from satellite footage. So I have a huge photo bank full of screenshots. A lot of them with the biggest scars are often at Popeyes and Dunkin' Donuts. And then this one happened to be at a COVID testing site near one of the West Side hospitals in Chicago. it was really just like very compelling to me to see this giant squiggle, very visible from Google Images, and kind of at once realizing that the giant squiggle was because of a year of directing people through the same exact trail for testing. So being able to see that giant, like, to me, very whimsical looking squiggle, and relating that to like this massive amount of managing the movement of people through one's particular site over time, and how that's like left this giant scar that also kind of like references other experiences in our environment. And then, like, while I had no intention of making art in response to the pandemic, it did heighten the prevalence and collective awareness of boundary making objects and its inherent relationship to human activity, even with the absence of a body. So I lived next to several testing sites where they were full all the time of cars, of people. And then at the end of the day, the end of the shift, as the sun was setting, the cars had all gone from the lot, the tents had been taken down, and instead there was a field of fluorescent traffic cones that felt like these ghosts that still remained in the space, because it's still the object in which we use to move human bodies around. So for me, I was also thinking about color, how that creates the sense of time passing, or particular times in the day or night. So I was looking a lot at lilac and these deep blues, and then also oranges, of thinking about the lamppost, how that changes the way that like your phone or your camera might capture the color temperature as well. And then also thinking about the emotional motives of certain colors and how that gets evoked through this lilac that might be about like dusk, or something that feels a little bit more pensive. So thinking also about like how much color kind of evokes these emotions for me. And yeah, I am still thinking always about asphalt, about travel, about commutes, and the vision, like the visual language that kind of always exists, that is also very similar to how we speak, how things are redacted in space, and how we kind of have these inherent relationships to some of these materials that often feel like not connected or disconnected from the human body. And for me, I really enjoy sitting in the wonder, kind of thinking about how deeply they are connected to the human body. And that is the conclusion of my talk. Thank you guys for listening in. Yep. Yeah, I'd love to hear questions. Yes. Yeah. How would you offer like advice to, aspiring artists who might have open Yeah, so your question is because I had to wait like 3 years to access some very inaccessible equipment, what would be my advice to aspiring artists in navigating resources that are hard to come by? Yeah, so that's something that I think everyone will always have to deal with, is when you don't have all the resources that you are educated on, that you have like full access to. How do you figure out where those come from outside of those connections? And I think that community is so important. I think that the myth of the individual artist is a myth, and that I've benefited so much, and I still am. I find like investing in your community and being connected to your community as the best way to access resources together and to grow a lot faster and with a lot more support. So I think that I'd really think about the value of all the spaces in which you have the opportunity to create networks, and not thinking about it in this like stale professional way, but like putting your friends and your colleagues up for opportunities that will support their practices. And I think that being present and generous in that way of, really like going hard for the people is a really important way to nurture your network. And if someone has access to a resource, they share that with you. And I think that's also how I've sort of navigated my own like politics about being an artist, is like things are so inaccessible, and I don't want them to be harder for somebody else if they don't have to be. So actually, I Loom Room is a project in my own studio where I was able to receive grant money to purchase 2 floor looms. So not the digital loom. I'm working on that though. But that was also to sort of start an art-centered fiber-based studio in Chicago where more people can rent time on this equipment. They don't have to personally buy the equipment and have studio space that they have to be responsible for. So again, like being connected with people who are thinking deeply about access and trying to stay connected through that. There are various maker spaces in Chicago, in other cities. Stay connected with them. If they have opportunities for you to visit them or get in touch with somebody, I think like the curiosity of figuring out where all those resources are, like don't, I think, underestimate the value of like word of mouth or your networks. So I think my answer to that question would be invest in your community. And if one person knows of a resource, it's going to travel a lot faster. But make a list of the things that you need. And I think get heads together with other people who are also looking for those similar resources. I think that would be my best suggestion. Any other? Go ahead. Yes. What first drew me to weaving? I had and still have a very strong interest in fashion before I went to art school. And I took one class in fashion and decided it was not for me, not the lifestyle that I want for myself, not the way that I want to be creative. And I was just trying to think about what other ways I could kind of align myself a little bit closer to those interests without having to design garments. And I come from a painting and drawing and photography background. So for me, I was interested in exploring something different like sculpture when I went to art school. And I think fiber sort of becomes that catch-all between the two of exploring other material interests while also getting to maybe think about it a little closer to the fashion world. So that's where I think that was what compelled me to take my first class in intro to fibers. And from there, I wove on a frame loom. So the really simple one that is like portable, and it's just a frame where you roll warp threads over. So it's not at all like very similar to the floor loom or the jacquard loom, but from there I just loved it immediately. I think there's something really exciting about the limitations of the grid that just felt like a fun puzzle to figure out, whereas painting and photography, there's so much freedom with the material that I enjoyed the limitation, I think, of somebody who just felt a little bit like I needed some constraints. So I really enjoy kind of figuring out how to create hyper specific kinds of imagery on something that isn't typically supposed to create those things. Yeah.
There's a question from Zoom chat. You described the process from which translates written text into physical manifestation.
Yeah, great question. I called it poesis. So let me pull up exactly how to spell that. Just a minute. It's Poiesis. And I was reading Johanna Drucker's interview or just text about figuring the word and her research on language and yeah, the act of translating, thinking about graphic design and typesetting, and that's kind of where the her writing like led me into thinking about that. And the person who also helped me make these letterpress prints was somebody who studied with, I think, her husband at Columbia College, and told me about this particular framework, and I just really love it. Yes, go ahead. Right. So your question is any advice on how to approach grant writing? Yeah. That feels like a large majority of my studio practice is spent writing. I think that's really kind of like people think that you're just in the studio making work, but actually, like, I didn't make any work for 8 months right after the residency, and most of that time was spent on admin, setting up like other business things, and definitely grant writing, application writing. I spend a lot of time writing, and I think my advice really is to, when you're starting out, it can be really daunting and you're not really sure how to market your thoughts to get people to give you money. It's a very specific way of trying to convince people that. And I think it's exhausting I think one, I like really don't love the idea of having to explain yourself in such a meticulous way in order to prove that you're deserving of resources. So that's like my baseline. But how do you learn to work within that? I would say just practice. So get yourself a Excel doc and fill it with like lists of various grants that you've seen other artists that you might see as role models or are aspiring to kind of get the same opportunities. Especially if their work is very similar, then the people who have probably supported that artist are more likely to engage with your work as opposed to just a cold call to another gallery that doesn't typically show or support the work that you do. So thinking one about your audience, but also just practicing. So practice writing. I edit my artist statement probably every 2 applications. Sometimes I have actually like a document where I have 4 different versions of artist statements based on different word counts and based on sort of the kind of audience that I might be applying to, because I've like sort of learned how to create different versions of them. And then sometimes I Frankenstein them for a new application if they need it to be a little bit different. So having a stockpile of various application materials, I think I've accumulated probably like 50 different applications that I keep all in the Google Drive over the past 3 years. And I think that, yeah, practicing and rewriting and trying to hone the language better will be your best like asset. I'd say that I didn't get any grants for the first 2 years, and then last year I received $15,000 from one grant and then 4,000 through two other ones. So I do think that I would attribute a lot of that to having practiced, of having asked for feedback for when I could, attending various webinars on more successful grant writing or more successful framing, and just kind of trying to test the waters on how the wording of your concepts and your ideas can maybe be a bit more effective. But I would say don't be discouraged. I hate that the art world operates on scarcity, that we have to prove ourselves as exceptional to receive funding. And I think the best way to do it is just to apply to very broadly to as many opportunities that make sense for you, and to practice and not to feel like being rejected to all the things that you apply for are a reflection of the lack of ability on your part. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You know, this loom that you made most of the work on upstairs feels like it has like this equal digital and analog component. And I wonder, talk about like just what that does to you artistically or psychologically or emotionally. How it affects you.
Yeah. So how does the equipment that I work on affect me psychologically and creatively, sort of traversing the line between analog and digital? I think that I think I really enjoyed working on the digital jacquard loom because it offered both those things. If I just made a beautiful design file and then sent it off and I didn't get to be part of the making process, which people do, and I also have pieces in my studio that are from that. I think the enjoyment of the challenge of the puzzle making part, that part isn't really as present. As someone who loves craft, who loves being meticulous about all the little details, and who enjoys putting those things together, I think that the jacquard loom offers that for me, so that I'm able to still enjoy the sensibilities of the photography practice that I have, as well as the digital play that can be a little bit more efficient sometimes in terms of creating compositions, and the spontaneity of that, and how I can translate that directly into something that I still get to, get back pain from, and still get to be at the loom and spontaneously think about oh, I actually want to turn this into a gradient. I want to shift this gray into a lilac. I want to throw 2 inches of orange in here. So I really enjoy that process, that it's not just extremely planned out, which I love planning things as a very organized person. But I also really love being able to create these parameters for myself and then play within them. And I think that the digital loom and the floor loom allows me to do that, because if you don't plan everything out, the threads are not in the place they should be, not everything's set up correctly, you can't play in that setup. So I think it sort of offers the balance and the tension of something that's really hyper organized and something that can be really spontaneous, that can be collaged in a moment's notice. So I can open files and then close them and open a different file. So I can digitally collage this weaving together from various different files by just changing the coding that's in it. So I think it offers a lot of things that I think are also still untapped because I have so little access to it. But I think I enjoy the tension of the balance in the two. Yes.
So you kind of oh, like a fabric, it's like this grid of that. But you ever find it's you have this group I really like this thing, but constraints don't align with the thing. Is it I guess how do you have what's your mindset around things not aligning with the constraints?
Okay. So what's my mindset? I enjoy constraints, but what's my mindset when the various factors of creating a project don't align with those constraints? So that's a great question. I also think that I often try to resist being seen as just a textile artist, as just a weaver, because I'm not. I also paint, I also print. I think that photography is inherent to my practice. I love these sort of multifaceted ways in which I understand information, I understand the world around me, and how I then translate that information into whatever I think fits. So I would say that I'm not married to the idea that I have to create in one kind of constraint. So if it doesn't make sense through weaving, then I did these letterpress prints. And if it didn't make sense in print in that one form, then I did screen printing. And if it made sense or painting offered a more compelling sort of like concept to the idea, then I would go with painting. And so and I also really love like bookmaking and publications, like just sort of juxtaposing ideas together and words together that don't necessarily have to be a fully formed, like fleshed out, I like artwork that goes, on the wall. I think that I'd like to think that I can be very flexible about the various constraints that I want to pick, because sometimes they don't make sense. Sometimes this idea, like the weaving, will lose a lot of resolution and image fidelity. And if the image and the details in that like composition are important to me, and I think I would lose a lot of that, and I wouldn't necessarily gain what I want out of that through weaving, then it absolutely should be through something else. So I really love being able to have so many options. And if I have to pick up a new skill in order to make it make sense, or if I fabricate it and commission someone else to do it, I'm very open to that as well. So actually right now I'm working on like these sculptural forms that I'm like surfacing with weavings, but the sculptural forms are a very different departure as well, because I'm just like, let's bring all of them together sometimes. We may not pick one of the constraints, or we can do all of them. So yeah.
What inspired you to present like real art and higher art?
Yeah. I think I don't really know when that shift happened where I started to see them as scars. I think the reason why I call the work that I've been doing like sad ground art is maybe like the frank way to say it is that as I'm navigating my own personal like losses or discomforts, I often did that while I was in transit to something as a commuter. If I'm in the car, or if I'm walking, or I'm on the train, that often was the space for me to just like sort of sit there with my thoughts. And I think that a lot of the times when you're like just thinking about the posture of your body when you're sad, you're not really looking up, you're not making eye contact with people. There's a bit of a shoegazing happening. And so for me, the posture of your body, I was looking at the ground. I was noticing a lot of details about it. And I think that I've always sort of like thought about the metaphor of what some of these objects that feel like they're not really like related to the human body, how they actually do offer some ways of understanding my like sense of self. So thinking about like the marginal or the peripheral details of a space, like there's always these like wonderful destination, like highlights of a space, but what are you doing when you're looking at the things that don't seem to matter? The gutters, the sides of the walls, the tiles on the floor, and what does that act of seeing kind of like evoke for you in understanding the world around you? So I'd say it was just from looking at things, and I think a lot of the artwork is kind of expressing the DNA of seeing, of one person's way of understanding or seeing the world. And I'd say that the best way to answer that question is that I was walking and I was driving and I saw a lot of those, and I started to think about them as these really kind of like aggressive marks. They have a lot of emotion to it. these parking lots where people convene, and that is also like sort of this illicit culture that I think also like evokes some other emotions to it. So I think that it does sort of similarly like with calligraphy or how someone's handwriting tells you a lot about their personality or their state of mind. I think that the ways that we leave these marks in space are very similar. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. So the question was, what is my schedule like when it comes to how consistently I make work? Yeah, I would say very inconsistent. For someone who's very organized, I have a very like specific schedule that I like define pretty much every hour of the day for myself at the beginning of the week to manage the projects. And in the 8 months following the residency where I didn't make any work, I was often just like logging in computer work. I was sitting in my studio and just answering emails, setting things up, working on my inventory and applying for other opportunities or managing other projects. And so I'm in the studio, I'm a full-time artist, and I am in the studio 5 to 6 times a week, and usually from like 11 to 9. I'm trying to do better about the schedule. So I'm trying to like end my days earlier and have a few more boundaries for myself. But I'd say that I outputted a ton. Like I made 30 pieces in 27 days in 1 month. And that was about like 1.5 pieces a day, which is a lot. And so from that, I just like did not need or feel compelled to make more work after that. So I think that because of the limited accessibility of making certain works, I sort of had to operate within those time constraints, spurts of making a ton. I don't enjoy it. I would love to be able to have access so that I can be in there every week for a couple hours so that I have the space to like experiment and test things out and take things slow. So I have been trying to implement that new schedule now because I have a really busy exhibition schedule. So I'd say that since January, I have been setting aside like 2 days a week to just devote to studio time, whether that's like going to buy supplies or stretching frames or like designing new ideas or working on several, like 5 different projects at once. And then 2 days of the week are devoted to like emails and admin things. So for me, I think that separation of like my time and like which hat I decide to wear when I come into work, because I play the role of like 5 different people in one company. That's sort of how I structure my time, I'd say. So prior to this year, it was a lot more sporadic. And right now I'm trying to shift it into being in the studio and making and creating artwork a few days a week.
We end with a very loaded question. What is your advice to students?
That is a very loaded question.
So
It's a very open question. I think it would be in figuring out, identifying for you like what your goals are, because not everyone who studies art goes to art school or even has a studio practice. Their schedules all look very different. Their goals look really different. So I'd say like being open, like I think something that's worked really well for me, because I graduated and didn't know what I was going to do. I had no goals or intentions about what things looked like for me. And I think that being kind and gentle to yourself about letting that stuff come to you as a response to trying things out and not being super attached to the outcome of one decision. So I did not think that I would only be at a couple jobs like for 6 months, but some of them really sucked. they were really awful. I think that I have a pretty like high tolerance for misery, and like the factory job, that was miserable, and I lasted 6 months, and I went and did historic preservation, which put me on construction sites, which was really intellectually interesting, but also physically exhausting. But I thought at the time it was a really great setup because I had, it was a contract position, so I had a lot of freedom to be in the studio, and then I had like work 10 hours a day for a couple weeks at a time. So it was like sporadic, but at the time, and then I just like realized that that was not how I wanted to work, and I didn't know that before going in. So I think being really open to testing the waters on something that you're not super certain about, and that it was really scary for me because I love having everything predetermined. But I think just being really attuned to like what, like how your body is responding and how you're responding. If you're not getting sleep for like 2 months on end because of you're dreading your job, like then it's time to rethink like what other factors in your life might need to shift. And I think for me, I didn't set out to be a full-time artist, but it just like things sort of shifted and aligned, and I was like, this is the way I want to spend my time and my money, and it's a lot of time and a lot of money. And like I think I still sometimes think like what might be the end of this process, where I kind of go back to having multiple jobs at once as opposed to just fully focusing on my full-time practice. So I'd say because there's no blueprint that makes sense for everyone, being really kind to yourself as you're testing and drawing this blueprint as you're going, because that's been my journey, I'd say. Yeah. There was one question online. I don't know if we have time or if that'll have to be a mystery that we leave hanging. Yeah, okay. Let me read this question and we can end there. In your process, do you intentionally situate the work in dialogue with themes of insider/outsider, Eastern, Western, avant-garde, traditional, or are those aspects of your identity as an Asian American more in the background? Interesting question. So I think that's a loaded question too. I think having a education in art history in art school that is going to be traditional education, there's always going to be a response to the structures of the histories that came before you. And so I think that I am I'm responding and benefiting from the research of people who have come before me. I learned a lot of theory and talked a lot about various like art historical movements in art school. So I'd say that like these themes are going to be present because they're part of my education. I'd say that the Asian American part is something that I think I could go on and on about. So I'm trying to figure out how to make this shorter, but I'd say that there is no, in the same way that like racial identity is not a monolith, like there's no one way of being an Asian American artist. And I think that expecting or wanting to see certain signifiers of what it means to be a insert identity in the work is really limiting and can pigeonhole your own understanding of like how you can explore those concepts for yourself. Because I am an Asian American woman, my work is inherently Asian American, and that because that is my lived experience. And like I said, all of my work is materializing the DNA of my way of seeing the world. And my way of seeing the world is not going to be the way that somebody else sees the world. So I think that to answer the question, it is in the background, but it's always there. It's like, that's me. The artist does inform the reading of the work. And for me, I think I like think that, I mean, I grew up in Ohio and surrounded in a place where I always felt like slightly uncomfortable. I wouldn't say that it was always attributed to racial identity. I think there are a lot of reasons why someone will grow up uncomfortable. And that kind of goes back to like, yeah, if you're not making eye contact with the people who are in the center of the room and you're looking at the periphery, what are the things that you're noticing? Or if you work in like these low wage ruling jobs, who are the people who you're surrounded by, and who are the people who inform like the things that you care about or you look at, like in observing these like window reflection weavings and drawing from like shuttered storefronts. Like I'm living in neighborhoods in which there's a lot of movement, a lot of change, and sometimes those changes aren't really pleasant or very equitable. And so I think that I like to be able to, in sharing the things that I observe about the world, that those might be touch points for other people to think about those signifiers and what that means for themselves. But yeah, to answer the question, I think that whatever I do is Asian American because that is who I am. And it doesn't have to be a blatant thing in the work. That's readily understandable. And I think we'll end on that. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions.
Thanks, Hope, so much. Just a quick programming note. Hope is going to be around. We're going to have a reception for her show in the library. So come and get a beverage, come hang out, come see the work. That's going to start at 4 o'clock. So like skip the last 20 minutes of your art class and come on up to the library. Let's again give another round of applause for Hope Wang. Thank you so much.